So King Charles just quietly stripped Queen Camilla of her most powerful institutional tools and handed the keys directly to Catherine. And the absolute second Camilla's team realised what was happening, they allegedly tried to force a written, legally binding contract to protect her status. And honestly, the fact that the palace did not just say no, but completely shut her out of the room, tells you everything you need to know about who is actually running the firm right now. Like, this is where it stops being just a family story and turns into a total corporate takeover. Before we get into all of it, make sure you hit subscribe right now, so you do not miss updates as more details come out. All right, let us start where the story actually begins. And here is the part that actually gets crazy. She did not just ask for a favour from her husband. She wanted it in writing. And the way she was rejected is something you almost never see inside the royal family. Usually when there is a major disagreement between the senior royals, the palace uses extremely polite language to cover it up. They have meetings about having more meetings. They slowly phase things out over months or even years, so nobody loses face in the public eye. But that is absolutely not what happened here. At exactly 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, Camilla's team was essentially told that her role was entirely negotiable. And when I say told, I mean they were completely and utterly stonewalled. There was no gentle negotiation. There was no polite letdown over a cup of tea. Her staff walked into what they thought would be a standard administrative meeting, and they were just handed a reality check that felt significantly more like a brutal corporate firing than a family discussion. Like, this is where it stops being a family disagreement. That is a power move. And it backfired spectacularly. Because while her team was busy trying to draft up demands and protect her territory, King Charles was already busy transferring the actual power out of her hands. He took control of key arts and health patronages and moved them straight over to Catherine's office without any public warning. And we are not talking about some small local charities that nobody has ever heard of. We are talking about the massive, heavy-hitting institutions. Specifically, he handed over the £45 million Royal National Theatre Trust. Think about what that actually means for a second. That is a massive amount of institutional influence, donor money, and cultural power just casually shifted across the palace courtyard. To hand that to Catherine is basically crowning her the new cultural face of the United Kingdom. And the absolute second that paperwork cleared, and the transfer was official, the visual difference between the two women was staggering. If you looked at Camilla's official calendar for the upcoming quarter, it suddenly looked completely empty. It was like a ghost town. Events she had championed for years, relationships she had spent decades building, were just gone from her schedule. No explanations, no transitions, just erased. Meanwhile, Catherine's schedule was packed tight. And here is the thing you need to understand. It was not packed with regular charity visits or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Her schedule was suddenly filled with closed-door meetings involving the king's own senior advisors. The men in grey suits, the people who actually run the country behind the scenes, were now sitting in Catherine's private office. And honestly, when you look at that contrast, you realise Camilla was not just being sidelined, she was being entirely cut out of the institutional loop. Her team was scrambling, making phone calls that suddenly were not being returned. People who used to answer her staff on the first ring were suddenly unavailable. That is not an accident. That is a coordinated strategy. And that more than anything else tells you exactly who is pulling the strings right now. But to understand why Charles pulled the trigger on this massive shift right now, and why Camilla panicked the way she did, you have to look at what she was actually holding on to. Now here is what makes this even more significant. We are not talking about who gets to cut the ribbon at a hospital, or who gets to wear the nicest tiara to a state dinner. People look at the royal family and they see the outfits and the carriages and they think that is where the power is. But that is just the surface. Basically, in the royal world, your patronages are your bank account of power. Without them, you are just a person wearing an expensive hat living in a very old house. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what a patronage actually is in plain English. When a royal becomes a patron of a major organisation, they are essentially taking a seat as a hyper-powerful board member. They get access to billionaires, politicians, and massive media networks. They direct policy, they influence government funding, and they control the narrative. Camilla had spent 20 years meticulously building a specific portfolio of these patronages to make herself absolutely indispensable to the monarchy. She knew that the public did not naturally love her, so she created a safety net built out of hard work and institutional control. By the time she officially became queen, She was personally overseeing organisations that controlled hundreds of millions of pounds in donor funds. That is real tangible leverage. And honestly, she was incredibly smart about it. She focused on literacy, domestic health, and the arts areas where she could quietly build an army of loyal supporters who relied on her royal stamp of approval to keep their funding flowing. She wove herself so deeply into the fabric of these charities that removing her seemed impossible without causing a massive public relations disaster. But here is the thing you need to understand. That power only exists as long as the monarch allows it to exist. The king can giveth, and the king can taketh away. And by stripping these specific patronages away from her, Charles was not just freeing up her schedule so she could take a vacation. He was bankrupting her institutional capital. He was taking away the very tools she used to justify her position at the top of the hierarchy. Without those charities, her ability to command the attention of the press or influence public conversation drops to zero. And ask yourself this: why would Catherine even want these specific roles? Because Catherine understands the game just as well, if not better. Taking over a £45 million trust does not just give Catherine more work, it officially cements her as the executive future of the family. It tells every politician, every donor, and every media outlet in Britain that if you want to deal with the royal family for the next few decades, you no longer go through Camilla, you go through Catherine. We are not talking about a ceremonial title here. This is a total reallocation of the monarchy's working capital. And honestly, when you realise how long it took Camilla to build that influence, and how quickly it was wiped away, you have to go back to the original deal she made to understand why she was so terrified of losing it. Because the foundation she was standing on was always meant to be temporary, and the ghost of the woman who came before her was about to prove exactly why. But to truly understand why the king could do this without flinching, and why the public is absolutely fine with it, you have to go back to April 2005. Most people remember the wedding. They remember the civil ceremony and the somewhat forced smiles. What most people forget is the fine print they promised the public just to get the country to accept the marriage in the first place. And here is the part that honestly turns the stomach when you think about the history of this family. When Charles and Camilla finally got married, the public was still fiercely protective of Princess Diana's memory. The anger was still incredibly raw. So, to avoid a total public revolt, the palace made a very specific, very formal promise. They stated officially that Camilla would never be queen. They invented the title of Princess Consort, specifically to assure the British people that the woman who played such a massive role in Diana's misery would never take her ultimate crown. Like, this is not new. This goes back further than most people realise. That promise was the only reason the public tolerated her. But the absolute second Queen Elizabeth passed away, that promise was tossed into the fire. Charles dragged Camilla onto the throne with him, and the palace simply expected everyone to have amnesia. And for a little while it seemed like they got away with it. People were polite, but politeness is not love. The public never actually loved Camilla. They just stopped actively booing her. She was standing on a floor made of thin ice, hoping nobody would notice the cracks. And then early in 2024, the ice broke. When Catherine announced her cancer diagnosis, the reaction was staggering. It felt like a bomb went off in the middle of the country. People were genuinely deeply devastated. The flowers, the messages, the pure, unforced empathy that poured out for Catherine was something the palace had not seen since August 1997. It was the exact same raw protective love that the public had for Diana. And honestly, that is the detail that changes everything. The public reaction proved that the Diana layer of this story never actually faded. It just transferred to Catherine. The public sees Catherine as the rightful emotional heir to Diana's legacy. She is the mother putting her children first, facing a brutal public spotlight with quiet dignity. While Camilla spent decades scheming to get the crown, Catherine simply earned the hearts of the people by being genuine. This is what Camilla saw happening. She looked at the oceans of flowers for Catherine, and she realised that her own carefully constructed PR image was nothing compared to genuine public devotion. She realised that no matter how many charities she ran, she would never, ever be loved like that. And more importantly, she realised that Charles saw it too. He knew that the survival of the monarchy rested entirely on the woman the public actually cared about. Camilla knew the ice was cracking beneath her feet, which is exactly why she tried to lock the doors before anyone could throw her out. She knew what was coming, and she decided to make a desperate play to stop it. And this is the detail that stopped me cold when I first read it, because the strategy was actually pretty clever if you think about it. What she miscalculated was just how ruthless her husband was willing to be. She did not just ask for a pinky swear that things would stay the same. She was allegedly asking Sir Jonathan Arborfield, the estate's senior legal counsel, for a binding consort continuity clause. The plan was staggering in its ambition, and honestly, staggering in its audacity. Camilla's inner circle drafted a formal, highly confidential memo. This document essentially demanded written guarantees that her rank, her remaining jobs, and her inner circle advisory status would remain completely untouched, regardless of how much power Catherine accumulated over the coming years. She wanted a legal firewall built around her royal status. She wanted to make it institutionally impossible for anyone, including the king himself, to slowly age her out of the business. Does any of that sound like respect for the monarchy, or does it sound like a terrified corporate executive trying to negotiate a golden parachute before she gets fired? Think about what that actually means for a second. She was demanding this continuity contract at the exact same time that both her husband and her daughter-in-law were battling severe life-threatening health crises, while the rest of the family was focused on literal survival. Camilla's team was focused on securing her contractual leverage. And here is the things you need to understand about how close this actually came to working. It was not just a crazy idea tossed around over drinks. This memo was actively moving through the channels. It had specific legal mechanisms attached to it. It named specific trusts, specific funding amounts, and specific access rights to the king's daily briefings. It was sitting on a mahogany desk in the legal department, being reviewed by the men who write the rules for the crown. If Sir Jonathan Arborfield had stamped that document and pushed it through the final approval stage, Camilla would have locked in her power permanently. She would have become an untouchable force within the palace, completely immune to public opinion, and completely shielded from Catherine's rising star. The paperwork was immaculate. The timing, capitalizing on the chaos of the medical emergencies, was incredibly sharp. She had been building toward this kind of security for years, and she was one step away from pulling it off. All it needed was the final nod from the monarch. Just one quiet signature behind closed doors, and the future of the monarchy would have been permanently chained to a woman the public barely tolerates. But there was one person inside that building who saw exactly what she was doing. And that person does not play political games. That person is the ultimate protector of the crown's integrity. And what she did next completely blew up Camilla's master plan. Okay, so here is the part that actually changes everything. Because a secret document is only dangerous until the wrong person finds it. And in Buckingham Palace, there is nobody you want finding your secrets less than Princess Anne. What Princess Anne allegedly saw on that desk changed the entire picture. According to insiders, the draft of the Consort Continuity contract was quietly making its rounds through the senior legal offices, waiting for the right moment to be slipped in front of the king. But Princess Anne does not wait for briefings, and she does not ask for permission to review institutional changes. She acts as the unofficial enforcer of the late Queen's legacy. And honestly, nobody intercepts a threat faster than the Princess Royal. Sources suggest that Anne caught wind of the specific legal maneuvers Camilla's team was attempting. She did not call a meeting with the communication team. She did not leak anything to the press. She walked straight past the aides right into Charles's private office and dropped the reality check directly onto his desk. And here is where the story shifts. You have to imagine Charles in that moment. He is dealing with his own mortality. He is watching his daughter-in-law handle a massive health crisis with absolute grace. And then his sister walks in and essentially proves that his wife's team is trying to legally corner him while he is vulnerable. That is the moment the blinders came off. Charles is a lot of things, but he is fundamentally a monarch first, and you do not back a monarch into a legal corner. When Charles looked at the actual written demands, the specific clauses trying to lock in Camilla's power against Catherine's rise, he realised exactly what was happening. This was not a wife asking for security. This was a rival faction trying to secure funding and influence against the future of the crown. Anne's discovery reframed the entire last 20 years for him. He saw that Camilla's endless push for patronages was never just about serving the country. It was about building a fortress. And ask yourself this: what do you do when you realise someone inside your own house is quietly changing the locks? You do not argue with them. You take away their keys. That discovery was the pivot point of the entire modern monarchy. The moment Charles read those demands, the sympathetic husband disappeared, and the ruthless CEO woke up. He had all the information. He knew exactly what Camilla was trying to do. But what he actually did next, the specific way he dismantled her plan, was so cold and so sudden that absolutely nobody saw it coming. He did not make a speech. He did not give an interview to a friendly journalist. He just looked at the document, saw the demands, and quietly dropped the hammer. And this is actually where it gets kind of brilliant when you think about it. Because Charles knew that if he fought Camilla's team directly, it would turn into a massive internal war. So instead, he used a weapon that she could not possibly fight against. He officially rejected the written guarantee. He simply refused to sign the Consort Continuity clause. But he did not stop there. Rejecting the contract was just the defence. The offence was much more brutal. Charles invoked a specific institutional mechanism known as the sovereign's prerogative over patronages. Basically, in plain English, this means the king has the absolute unquestionable legal right to reassign any royal charity, trust or duty to anyone he chooses at any time, without asking for a single vote of approval. Within a matter of days, he used that prerogative to execute a flawless surgical strike on Camilla's portfolio. He immediately transferred the top 3 arts and health charities, the absolute crown jewels of her public influence, directly to Catherine. He did not ask Camilla to hand them over. He did not suggest a transition period. He just legally changed the names on the trust documents. One day Camilla was the executive patron, and the next day she was completely locked out of the building. Now, some of you are probably asking whether the king can even do this without causing a massive legal headache. And the answer is yes. Here is why this move was so incredibly sharp. By refusing to sign Camilla's contract, he kept the monarchy completely flexible. The palace legal team basically told Camilla's advisors that tying the king's hands with a written agreement would be detrimental to the crown's ability to adapt. They used corporate speak to tell her she was entirely expendable. This move was irreversible because Catherine accepted the roles immediately. Once the Princess of Wales, the most beloved woman in the country, takes over a charity, you cannot exactly ask for it back without looking like a monster. Charles knew this. He used Catherine's immense public popularity as an impenetrable shield. Camilla could not complain, she could not push back, and she certainly could not leak her frustration to the press without looking jealous of a woman recovering from cancer. The speed and decisiveness of the move left Camilla's inner circle completely paralysed. There was no negotiation, no warning, and no compromise. Charles simply erased her institutional leverage with the stroke of a pen. The paperwork was signed, the trusts were transferred, and the power dynamic was permanently altered. But the public would not find out about any of this behind-the-scenes manoeuvring until much later. And when they finally did, they saw it with their own eyes in a way that was impossible to ignore. And here is the thing, nobody announced anything. Nobody made a formal statement from Buckingham Palace saying that Camilla had been demoted. But the message was completely clear to anyone paying attention. Because in the royal world, power is not announced with a press release, it is announced through choreography. It happened at a major palace reception in the late spring. The entire diplomatic corps was there. The billionaires, the politicians, the people who actually notice how the wind is blowing. To an outsider watching on television, it might look like nothing. Just a bunch of wealthy people standing around in a very fancy room holding expensive drinks. But in the royal world, every single gesture, every single footstep carries immense meaning. Catherine entered the massive reception hall, and she did not just walk in alongside Prince William. She was flanked by the king's 3 most senior private secretaries. These are the men who control access to the monarch. They are the gatekeepers of the British establishment. For Catherine to walk into a room with them, trailing her, whispering to her, managing the crowd for her, was the ultimate visual confirmation of absolute power. It was the king's way of telling the entire room, and by extension, the entire country, that Catherine speaks with his full authority. And honestly, when you look at the other side of the room, the contrast was brutal. Camilla was seated at a secondary table. She was completely cut off from the main advisory circle. The politicians and the major donors, the people who usually flocked to her side to secure funding or favours, were suddenly migrating across the room to stand near Catherine. The entire gravitational pull of the monarchy shifted in real time. You could see it in the body language. Camilla maintained her polite, frozen smile, doing exactly what she had trained for decades to do. But the silence around her was deafening. She was physically present at the centre of the monarchy, but institutionally she was standing outside in the cold. Every person in that room understood exactly what they were witnessing. The king had officially designated his successor's wife as the true centre of the court. The clip of that entrance spread everywhere online. Millions watched it, slowed it down, replayed it, because what it showed was deeply uncomfortable but absolutely fascinating. It was the visual proof that the old guard had been outmaneuvered. The power dynamic was now visible to everyone, stripped of all the polite palace PR. But behind the scenes, while the public was analysing the video clips, Camilla's team was completely falling apart, and the consequences of that night were about to hit them like a freight train. And Camilla's team went into full damage control mode. Within hours of that reception, there was this wave of carefully packaged messaging attempting to flood the media. Her allies quietly reached out to friendly newspaper editors, trying to plant stories that completely spun the narrative. They wanted the public to believe that Camilla was voluntarily stepping back, that she was gracefully handing over duties, because she wanted to focus on the king's health and her own well-being. But here is where the strategy completely fell apart. You can outspin a tabloid, but you cannot outspin the king. For a planted story to actually take root and survive in the British press, the main palace communications office has to quietly confirm it off the record. But when the reporters called the central press office to verify Camilla's graceful step-back narrative, the palace gave them absolutely nothing. They refused to confirm the stories. They left Camilla's allies completely stranded, looking like they were making excuses. That is not a miscommunication. That is the palace actively letting Camilla's PR strategy die on the vine. And honestly, that is when the panic truly set in for her inner circle. They realised that they no longer had the protection of the crown's invisible hand. She had spent 30 years outmanoeuvring people who underestimated her. She survived the Diana years. She survived the brutal public hatred. And she fought her way to the throne. But Charles simply cut the microphone, and suddenly she had no voice left. The collapse was not just in the newspapers, it was happening right inside her office. The specific evidence of defeat was impossible to hide. Within a 48-hour window, 2 of Camilla's most senior aides quietly handed in their resignations. These were people who had tied their entire careers to her rise to power. They did not leave because they wanted to spend more time with their families. They left because they looked at the board, saw that her office had permanently lost its teeth, and decided to abandon a sinking ship before it dragged their own reputations down. It was the moment that the reality finally caught up with the ambition. Camilla reportedly sat in her private sitting room watching her carefully constructed network of influence dissolve in real time. She finally understood that she had lost. The long game she had played for decades had ended in a quiet, ruthless checkmate. Her influence was evaporating faster than anyone could have predicted. And then Charles made one final move that closed the door permanently, making sure she could never, ever rebuild what she had just lost. And then just a few weeks later, Charles did something that made it impossible to pretend anymore. No statement, no press conference, no drama, just a permanent shift in the hierarchy that locked Catherine in and locked Camilla out for good. The king officially named Catherine as the central figure for the monarchy's next 10-year strategic initiative. This was not a charity role. This was the master plan for the survival of the crown over the next decade. But the real gut punch, the move that absolutely shattered any remaining illusion of Camilla's executive power, involved the red boxes. If you follow royal protocol, you know about the daily briefing boxes. These are the most restricted, highly classified documents in the country. They contain government secrets, intelligence briefings, and the true inner workings of the state. Historically, access to these boxes is the ultimate symbol of supreme power. Charles quietly issued a directive that cleared Catherine's office to be officially briefed on the strategic contents of those boxes. He legally bypassed his own wife and gave the ultimate state access directly to his daughter-in-law. He didn't need to fire Camilla. He just made her completely irrelevant to the actual operation of the country. And that was it. That was the whole thing. Done. The final action was so quiet that most of the public did not even realize the magnitude of what had just happened. But inside the palace, the shockwaves were massive. Camilla was left with her title, her jewellery, and her seat at the parades, but absolutely zero executive function. You have to imagine how Camilla experienced this final moment. To spend your entire adult life fighting for a seat at the absolute head of the table, enduring decades of global humiliation, only to finally get the crown and realise it is made of plastic. The real gold, the actual power, had been quietly carried out the back door and handed to a woman 30 years younger. There was no screaming, there was no dramatic confrontation, just the slow, agonising realisation that her era was over before it even really began. The power transfer was absolutely complete. It was a flawless execution of institutional discipline. Catherine emerged as the undisputed future, wielding more soft power and direct influence than any Princess of Wales in history. But when you step back and look at what this entire saga actually means for the future of the family and why it had to happen this way, the reality is honestly chilling. When you step back and look at the entire chain of events, what you actually see is a man choosing survival over sentimentality. This was never just about who gets to control a few charity patronages or who sits where at a dinner party. This was about the absolute survival of the British monarchy in the modern world. Charles looked at the polling numbers. He looked at the public mood, and he looked at the very real possibility that the institution could collapse under its own weight. He knew that the public's patience was wearing incredibly thin, and he made the coldest, most logical decision a monarch can make. He bet the entire future of his family on Catherine and William, because they are the only ones the public genuinely, authentically likes. He essentially acted as a ruthless CEO, cutting away a liability to protect his most valuable assets. But you cannot ignore the brutal human cost of what just happened. Charles executed a devastating corporate move against a woman who spent 30 years taking the bullets for him. Camilla stood by him through the absolute worst public relations disasters in modern history. She absorbed the hatred of an entire nation so he would not have to. And the moment a better, more popular asset came along, she was politely but firmly pushed into the background. She built the trap herself. She walked into it with her eyes open, believing that loyalty would eventually equal power. She was wrong. And honestly, the reason she was wrong brings us right back to the one person who never actually left the room. The unhealed wounds of the 1990s forced this outcome. The public never forgave, and they never forgot. Diana's memory is the architectural force that made the public reject Camilla's rise and absolute worship Catherine's grace. Camilla could wear the crown, she could ride in the gold carriage, but she could never earn the genuine authority that comes from being loved by the people. The past finally caught up with the present, and it demanded a course correction. The boy who walked behind his mother's coffin is now stepping into his power, backed by a wife who commands the absolute respect of the nation. King Charles simply read the writing on the wall and got out of the way, taking his wife's ambition down with him to ensure the crown survives another generation. The institution always wins, but the people inside it don't always get to keep what they were promised.